Welcome to Wicked Nightmares Horror Stories. These are real events we told as haunting bedtime tales. Let's get into it.
It was February 1959, deep in the frozen Ural Mountains of Soviet Russia. A group of 10 experienced hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute prepared for an expedition that would test their strength, skill, and endurance. Leading them was Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student with a reputation for discipline and precision. The group's goal was to reach Mount Otorten, a remote peak far beyond civilization. The conditions would be harsh, but for them, that was the point. This was a challenge worthy of elite hikers. The team consisted of men and women in their early 20s, all seasoned outdoors people. They were cheerful, intelligent, and confident. They took photos, joked in their diaries, and talked about what they'd do once they got back. But one of them, Yuri Yudin, would never make it that far. Partway through the journey, he developed severe knee and back pain and had to turn back. He said goodbye to his friends, unaware that it would be the last time he'd ever see them alive. The remaining 9 pressed on, skiing through snow and wind, climbing higher toward the area known as Kolet-Syakhl, a mountain whose name in the local Monsey language meant, Dead Mountain. They laughed as they set up camp near its slopes, unaware that something was watching them from the shadows of the storm. On February 1st, the hikers made camp on the eastern slope of Kolet-Syakhl. The weather had turned brutal. Visibility was poor, and temperatures had plunged far below zero. Some investigators later believed they were forced to stop there by the worsening storm, unable to see the forest that would have offered shelter just a mile downhill. But Igor Dyatlov, the group's confident leader, decided they'd camp right where they stood, on the slope itself. It was a bold decision, one that spoke to their experience and pride. They'd faced worse before. The group trusted him completely. As the wind howled around them, they worked in silence, slicing through the snow with their skis and shovels to flatten the ground. Their hands were numb, their breath freezing in midair, but they laughed between gusts, making jokes, shouting over the storm. By nightfall, they pitched their large canvas tent, anchored it against the slope, and crawled inside, 9 young adventurers huddled together against the biting cold. They ate dinner, took photos, and wrote in their diaries by the light of a flickering lantern. Their last recorded entry read, "The wind is strong. We feel we can conquer anything." Then they zipped up the tent, and went to sleep. Sometime between midnight and dawn, something happened. No one knows exactly what. There were no witnesses. But what's certain is that the group woke up in chaos. Something, or someone, terrified them so completely that 9 experienced hikers, people trained to survive blizzards, ripped their way out of their own tent from the inside, barefoot and half-dressed, into sub-zero temperatures. When rescuers finally found the campsite 2 weeks later, the scene looked wrong. The tent was still standing, half buried in snow, eerily preserved. But it wasn't unzipped, it had been slashed open from the inside with a knife. Their boots and jackets were still neatly arranged along the edges. Their food was laid out as if they'd been about to eat. It was like they had been interrupted mid-breath, and fled. Investigators followed the trail of footprints leading away from the tent. The prints were clear at first, bare feet, socks, even one with a single shoe. They stretched nearly a mile downhill before vanishing into the trees. There, at the edge of the forest, searchers found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonischenko. They were barefoot, dressed only in underwear, lying beside the remains of a small campfire. The branches above them were broken high up, as if one of them had climbed to look for the tent, or to escape something. Their hands were torn and raw, as though they had clawed desperately at the bark. It looked like they had tried to survive the freezing night by building a fire, but the cold had been merciless. Not far from there, 3 more bodies were discovered, Dyatlov, Kalmogorova, and Slobodin, positioned in a straight line leading back toward the tent. They had collapsed at intervals, one after another, as if each had fallen trying to crawl back home. The remaining 4 hikers were missing. For months, their bodies lay hidden beneath the snow until spring revealed them. When rescuers finally found them in a ravine deeper in the forest, the horror of what had really happened began to unfold. Two of them had massive internal injuries, crushed ribs, fractured skulls, but with no visible wounds, as though hit by an invisible force. One of the women was missing her eyes and tongue. Another was lying face down in running water, her body tinted an unnatural orange from exposure. The autopsy reports left investigators speechless. The official conclusion described the cause of death as a compelling natural force. No explanation beyond that. Then came another disturbing discovery. The clothing on some of the hikers tested positive for radiation. Not a trace amount, enough to raise alarms. No one could explain how or why. The area was closed off by Soviet authorities, and details were suppressed for decades. But among locals, stories began to spread. Some spoke of bright orange orbs in the sky the night the hikers died. Others whispered about secret military tests, parachute mines detonated over the mountains, shockwaves strong enough to crush bone without breaking skin. And yet others believed something not human had been out there with them. Something ancient. Something that didn't belong. The more investigators dug, the stranger it got. Why were the tent slashes from the inside? Why did they run barefoot into the dark? Why was there radiation on their cloth? And how could their injuries be so catastrophic without any external trauma? No one could agree on a single theory. Every explanation only raised more questions. Whatever happened that night on Kholat Syakhl, it was fast, violent, and utterly terrifying. 9 people vanished into the snow, leaving behind a scene so bizarre that even seasoned investigators described it as something out of a nightmare. And all that remained was their silent camp, a torn tent, untouched food, and the lingering echo of panic frozen forever into the ice. To this day, no one knows what the hikers saw in those final moments. Some say it was an avalanche. Some say it was the government. Others believe it was something that can't be explained at all. What we know for certain is that whatever scared them that night didn't just come from outside the tent. It came from within. When the group failed to return, their families knew something was wrong. These were experienced hikers, disciplined and organized. They had mapped everything, planned every stop, and left detailed notes of when they'd be back. Days passed. No word. No signal. Just silence. On February 20th, search teams were dispatched. Students, volunteers, soldiers, and even pilots joined the hunt. The Ural Mountains were unforgiving. Winds howled through the valleys like screaming voices, and snow swallowed everything in sight. The rescuers trudged through waist-deep drifts, scanning for any sign of life. Then, on the 9th day, a volunteer spotted something bright against the endless white, a flash of orange fabric peeking through the snow. It was the hiker's tent. Half collapsed, half buried, but still standing against the wind. As they approached, what they saw made no sense. The tent hadn't been blown open or torn by animals, it had been slashed open from the inside. Several long cuts ran through the thick canvas, like frantic escape routes. Inside, everything was neatly arranged, boots lined up, coats FO. Food laid out as if they'd been about to eat. Their cameras and diaries were untouched. It was like they'd planned to come back, but never did. Then, just outside the tent, rescuers noticed something in the snow. Footprints. Not just one or two, a trail of them, leading downhill. Some were barefoot. Others showed socks, or one shoe. 9 distinct sets of prints, frozen in perfect clarity, marching toward the forest below. Whatever happened, they hadn't been chased, the prints weren't scattered or running. It looked like they had calmly walked away, into the darkness. The trail stretched nearly a mile before fading into the trees. And that's where they found the first bodies. Under a large cedar tree stood the remains of a small campfire, its ashes long cold. Lying nearby were 2 of the hikers, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonischenko. They were barefoot, dressed only in their underwear. Their skin was marbled with frostbite. Their fingers were shredded, the bark of the cedar tree torn away several meters high, as if one of them had desperately tried to climb it, maybe to spot the tent, maybe to escape something unseen. The ground around them told a story of panic and survival. Broken branches, scattered twigs, burned wood, all evidence that they'd tried to stay alive, fighting the cold, fighting fear, fighting something else entirely. But they didn't make it. Not far from the cedar tree, searchers found 3 more bodies, Igor Dyatlov, Zina Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. They were lying between the forest and the tent, frozen mid-crawl, positioned in a line as if trying to get back to safety. Dyatlov's fists were clenched, his face turned toward the direction of the tent. Zina's body was angled uphill, her frozen expression locked in determination. Rustam's skull showed a small fracture, but no sign of external impact, as if he'd been struck by force from within. Their positions painted a heartbreaking picture. The group had split, some staying to survive by the fire, others trying to return to camp. None made it far. Still missing were the last 4 hikers, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, and Semyon Zolotaryov. For weeks, rescuers scoured every ravine and hollow. The snow was too deep, the terrain too harsh. Winter swallowed the mountain, hiding its secrets. Then, as the thaw came months later, a rescue team found a small ravine deeper in the forest. And there, buried under 4 meters of snow, they found them. But what they discovered didn't just deepen the mystery, it twisted it into something far darker. The last 4 bodies were lying close together, partially dressed in clothes that belonged to the others, proof that after the first deaths, the survivors had tried to share what little warmth they had left. Yet the autopsies told a horrifying story. Nikolai had a cracked skull, fatal but with no external wound. Semyon and Ludmila had massive internal injuries, broken ribs, crushed chests, similar to victims of a high-speed car crash. But their skin was untouched. No bruising. No cuts. Just catastrophic internal damage. Ludmila's body was the most disturbing. She was missing her tongue, her eyes, and parts of her lips, all gone. The official report claimed animals might have done it after death, but some rescuers didn't believe that. They said the wounds looked deliberate. Even stranger, the clothing they'd been wearing tested positive for radiation. Not a trace amount but high enough to set off Geiger counters. Where could it have come from? Theories began to spiral. Some said it was an avalanche, others whispered about military tests, parachute mines or sonic weapons. Locals spoke of orange orbs floating in the night sky. And a few believed something not human had found them in that forest. But the truth was, no one could explain it. 9 people went into those mountains. 9 people died in ways that. Their tent, their footprints, their wounds, everything pointed to something powerful, fast, and utterly terrifying. Whatever chased them that night didn't leave tracks. And more than 60 years later, the snow on Kholat Syakhl still covers the same ground, silent, white, and cold, keeping the secret of what really happened to the Dyatlov group frozen forever beneath its surface. The discovery of those final 4 bodies changed everything. What had seemed like a tragic case of hikers lost to the cold now looked like something far more sinister. The first 5 bodies could be explained away, hypothermia, panic, disorientation, but these 4. Their injuries defied logic. The medical examiner's report was unsettling. 2 hikers had chest fractures that required force comparable to a car crash. One man's skull was caved in, yet the skin was unbroken. Another woman, Ludmila Dubinina, was missing her eyes, lips, and tongue. But there was no evidence animals had scavenged them, the wounds were too clean. Her body also contained traces of radiation far above normal levels. It was as if she'd been exposed to something toxic before she died. When investigators shared their findings with the Soviet authorities, the response was immediate and chilling. The area was sealed off. Files were classified. Officially, the cause of death was written as a compelling natural force. But no one knew what that meant. Even the lead investigator admitted years later that he was pressured to close the case. To the public, it made no sense. Why would the government step in so quickly, unless there was something they didn't want anyone to know? Then came the eyewitness reports. In nearby villages, residents claimed that on the night of the hikers' disappearance, they saw glowing orange orbs hovering above the mountains. The lights moved slowly, silently, before vanishing behind the ridge. Some of the hikers' journals even mentioned seeing strange lights in the sky days before the tragedy. Were these military flares? Secret aircraft? Or something else entirely? Rumors spread that the hikers had stumbled upon a covert Soviet weapons test. During the Cold War, the USSR often conducted secret experiments in remote locations. Some theorized the group had been caught in the blast of a parachute mine, a weapon designed to detonate above the ground, creating shockwaves powerful enough to crush bones without leaving external wounds. That could explain the internal trauma, and the glowing lights. But if it was a military test, why were civilians allowed anywhere near it? And why had their clothes tested positive for radiation? Other theories were even stranger. Locals spoke of a legendary creature said to inhabit the Ural Mountains, a massive, humanoid figure they called the Menk, similar to the Yeti. One of the hikers had taken a photograph of what appeared to be a large, shadowy figure standing in the trees. To this day, no one knows what it was. Some believe it was one of the hikers, others are convinced it was something watching them. Then there were the inconsistencies. The footprints leading away from the tent were calm, measured, as if the group wasn't running in panic, but walking. Yet they were barefoot or wearing only socks. They moved single file down the slope, suggesting coordination, not chaos. So what forced them to leave their shelter in freezing temperatures, half-dressed, but still organized? Inside the tent, investigators found everything neatly arranged, boots lined up, coats folded. The stove wasn't even unpacked. It looked as if they had planned to come back. But the knife slashes cut from the inside said otherwise. Adding to the confusion, the last photo taken on one of their cameras showed bright, glowing orbs in the night sky. Some claim it was overexposure or a flash reflection. Others believe it captured the lights villagers had seen that same night. Whatever it was, it scared them enough to tear their way out into the deadly cold. And then there's the radiation. That detail was never supposed to be public. When journalists uncovered it years later, the government dismissed it as contamination from old military uniforms, but that didn't explain why only certain pieces of clothing had high readings, or why the levels varied from person to person. The secrecy only deepened the mystery. Reporters who tried to dig further found themselves stonewalled. Family members were told conflicting stories. Some were warned to stop asking questions. The official files went missing for decades. When the bodies were finally returned to their families, something seemed off. Their skin had turned an unnatural orange hue, their hair brittle and grayish. Some of the coffins were sealed shut. Parents weren't even allowed to view their children's remains. Decades later, independent investigators revisited the site and found more anomalies. The trees near the campsite showed signs of heat exposure, almost as if something had burned or scorched them. Yet, there were no signs of fire anywhere else. So what really happened that night on Dead Mountain? Some experts now believe a katabatic wind, a sudden rush of cold, dense air, may have caused panic, collapsing part of the snow above the tent. But that still doesn't explain the radiation, the missing eyes and tongue, or the massive internal trauma. Others think they were victims of a Soviet cover-up, perhaps they witnessed a weapons test or crashed military object and were silenced. And a few, still point to something stranger. To this day, hikers who visit Dyatlov Pass report hearing whispers on the wind, or feeling like they're being watched. Locals still avoid the mountain after dark. And even now, 65 years later, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in modern history, a story of 9 hikers who faced something on that mountain so powerful, so terrifying, it defied every law of nature. Whatever it was, it left them with shattered bones, missing faces, and a mystery that may never be solved. Over the decades, the Dyatlov Pass incident has spawned theories, books, documentaries, and debates, but no definitive answer. Each explanation seems to unravel as quickly as it is proposed, leaving more questions than answers. One of the earliest and most widely discussed theories was the snow slab avalanche. Some investigators argued that the slope above the hikers' camp was unstable. Heavy snow had accumulated over the days, and a sudden collapse could have slammed down on the tent. The hikers, hearing the rumble, might have cut their way out, thinking they were trapped beneath tons of snow. That explained why they left in a rush, some barefoot or in socks, but it failed to account for the extreme injuries. Massive chest fractures, skull injuries, and the absence of external bruising could not be caused by a mere avalanche. And why had 4 hikers wandered off into the forest rather than staying together to survive? Others leaned toward a military cover-up. The Soviet Union was conducting tests in remote areas of the Urals. Some theorists suggested that the hikers accidentally wandered into a restricted zone and witnessed secret experiments. The glowing orbs seen in the sky that night were interpreted as flares, aircraft, or experimental devices. Could the hikers have been struck by a shockwave from a nearby detonation? That might explain the internal injuries, the strange burns on clothing, and even the traces of radiation. But once again, there were problems. Military weapons testing typically left behind craters, debris, or evidence of explosives. At Dyatlov Pass, the snow was unmarked except for the hikers' footprints. And if it was a military test, why did the injuries vary so dramatically? Why did some hikers have crushed chests while others had missing facial tissue? Then there were the orange orbs. Locals living miles away claimed to see strange lights floating above the pass that night. Their movement was unnatural, they hovered, dipped, and glowed in ways that no conventional aircraft could mimic. When the hikers' camera film was developed, faint shapes appeared in the distance, unexplainable lights casting an eerie glow over the snow. Were these alien sightings? Some UFO theorists think so. Others claim it could have been reflections, but that doesn't explain why all 9 hikers reacted the same way, fleeing the tent, abandoning clothes, and heading into the deadly cold. The journals added another layer of mystery. Investigators pored over each page. For weeks before the incident, the entries were normal, accounts of hiking, maps, jokes, observations about the weather. They described the trails, the landscapes, and the camaraderie among the group. Nothing hinted at panic. Their meals were prepared and eaten calmly, their camp orderly. The entries suggest that whatever struck them hit suddenly, leaving no time to rationalize, no time to grab boots or coats for all of them. They had trusted their leader, Igor Dyatlov, to keep them safe. And whatever force confronted them, it overpowered that trust instantly. Some experts have speculated about a KGB experiment, suggesting that the hikers were deliberately exposed to a test they shouldn't have seen. Others think it could have been a natural phenomenon so rare and violent it left no trace, an unknown type of wind vortex, a sudden atmospheric pressure wave, or a catastrophic infrasound event that drove the group into terror. Researchers have recreated the conditions, demonstrating that certain wind patterns could produce tones that cause extreme panic, dizziness, and disorientation. Could a sound alone have driven the hikers from the safety of their tent into the icy dark? Then there are the bodies themselves. The first 5 were found in positions suggesting they had fled, trying to find shelter. But the last 4 were in the ravine, their injuries horrific and unexplained. 2 with massive chest fractures, 1 with a crushed skull, and Ludmila Dubinina missing her tongue, eyes, and lips. Yet their skin remained unbroken. Could some force, natural or man-made, generate pressure strong enough to fracture bones internally without leaving external trauma? The answer is still debated. Radiation complicates the story further. Certain patches of clothing tested positive for radiation far above normal. Was it a relic of military testing, contamination from an experiment, or something more bizarre? The Soviet authorities offered no clear explanation. Some researchers suggest it might have been residual from radioactive materials used in nearby projects. Others think it might have been deliberate contamination to discredit eyewitness accounts. Even small details fuel speculation. The tent had been cut open from the inside, suggesting that the hikers didn't leave gradually or rationally. Their shoes and clothes were left behind. Some of the hikers stripped down to underwear in sub-zero temperatures. Why? Did they believe it would protect them from some invisible threat? Did they think they were hallucinating from cold or panic? Or were they trying to escape something in a state of sheer terror? The trees nearby also offer eerie clues. Branches were broken high above the ground, as if someone or something had scaled them in a panic or perhaps tried to find help. There were reports of snow disturbed unusually around the area, not consistent with normal hiking patterns. Some think these anomalies were caused by the avalanche. Others think they suggest the presence of an external force, unknown and unseen. Families of the hikers received fuel. Corpses returned to relatives were bizarrely altered. Some bodies had a strange orange tinge, hair brittle, and hands cracked. Photos of the victims circulated, horrifyingly illustrating that these weren't ordinary deaths. Despite decades of speculation and official investigations, each new theory seemed to contradict the last. For years, the site itself was avoided. Locals swear the mountain is cursed. Hikers today report strange feelings, sudden chills, and shadows moving through the trees that seem impossible. Even experienced guides admit that there's an unexplainable weight to the air, an eerie stillness that presses down, as if the mountain remembers what happened. The Dyatlov Pass incident is more than just a mystery, it's a psychological puzzle. It challenges everything we know about human behavior, natural disasters, and unexplained forces. It's a story of 9 young people, full of life, skill, and optimism, who ventured into the wilderness and encountered something so unfathomable that even the authorities could not explain it. The tent remains a symbol of the last place they were safe. The footprints are a trail to nowhere. And the mountain itself is an eternal question mark. What exactly struck them that night? Was it a natural force, a human-made weapon, a supernatural presence, or something that science cannot yet define? To this day, climbers and researchers return to Dyatlov Pass seeking answers, only to leave with more questions. Satellite maps show anomalies. Videos capture unexplained flashes. Journals are revisited, scanned, and reanalyzed. Yet nothing conclusively solves the puzzle. 9 lives were lost, and the mountain keeps its secret. The wind still howls across Kolytsyakhl. Snow continues to blanket the slopes in pristine white. And for those who listen carefully, some swear they can hear faint voices carried by the wind, laughter, whispers, or cries from 9 hikers who disappeared into the storm and never returned. The Dyatlov Pass incident is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in our modern age, there are places and events that defy reason. That nature, human curiosity, or something else entirely can expose us to forces we do not understand. And for all the years that have passed, no matter the theories, no matter the investigations, the truth remains hidden. It may never be revealed. And that is what makes the story so haunting. A mountain keeps its secret, 9 hikers walked into history, and the world is left with only questions, whispers, and a chill that lingers long after the snow melts. By now, the story of the 9 hikers has become legend. Dead Mountain has haunted the imagination of investigators, thrill seekers, and true crime fans for more than 60 years. But even with every piece of evidence examined, the truth remains just out of reach. Some experts argue it was a natural disaster. A sudden katabatic wind, or a snow slab avalanche, may have struck with terrifying force, crushing the hikers' bones and forcing them into the freezing night. But that explanation only goes so far. It doesn't account for the precision of the injuries, the missing eyes and tongue, or the traces of radiation found on some of their clothing. Others point to military involvement. The Cold War was at its peak, and the Ural Mountains were a secretive testing ground. Perhaps the hikers stumbled upon an experiment gone wrong, a detonation or a weapons test that left them mutilated and irradiated. But again, there's no official record, and the Soviet authorities' swift sealing of the site fuels the suspicion. Was this a cover-up? Or simply bureaucratic secrecy amplified by paranoia? And then there are the accounts of the strange lights. Orange orbs, glowing above the mountains, seen by villagers and even captured faintly in photographs. Were these flares, military craft, or something more, unnatural? Could a creature, unknown and powerful, have terrorized them that night? Eyewitnesses speak of a large shadow in the trees, one that seems almost impossibly big, moving silently. The hikers' own footsteps suggest coordination, not panic. Something forced them out of their tent, but not in a mad dash. They walked, perhaps toward an unknown threat they couldn't confront, toward something waiting in the dark. Each theory has pieces that fit, yet none fits perfectly. And that is what makes the Dyatlov Pass incident so chilling. It's a puzzle with missing pieces. Each explanation, natural, military, or supernatural, has horrifying implications. Natural forces can be brutal beyond imagination. Secret experiments can turn ordinary people into collateral damage. And if something else, something truly unknown, exists on Dead Mountain, then the 9 hikers may have encountered a force beyond comprehension. What we do know is this: 9 young, experienced hikers vanished in the night, leaving behind evidence that defies logic. Their footprints froze in the snow, their tent cut open from the inside, their bodies showing trauma that no human force could inflict. They were terrified, yet methodical, orderly yet exposed to death. And the mountain still whispers their story. Some who visit Dyatlov Pass today report a feeling of being watched, a heaviness in the air, faint voices carried on the wind. The locals avoid the mountain at night, wary of the same force that claimed the hikers decades ago. And for anyone reading or listening to this story in the dark, it leaves the same unsettling question: what could make 9 capable, prepared people leave the safety of their tent in the dead of night, into a storm so fierce it would kill them within minutes? The Dyatlov Pass incident is a reminder that some mysteries resist explanation. Some questions remain unanswered, no matter how many experts investigate, no matter how many theories are proposed. And sometimes, that uncertainty is what makes a story unforgettable. It was August 1966, in a quiet neighborhood on Vinton Hill, a small, tree-lined slope in Niterói, Brazil. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where children played in the streets until the sun dipped below the horizon, and life moved at a measured, predictable pace. Except on this day, predictability was shattered. 2 men were found dead, lying side by side, on the grass at the base of the hill. At first glance, it might have looked almost peaceful. They were neatly dressed, as though preparing for some formal event. Their shoes were polished to a mirror-like shine. Their hands rested calmly at their sides, and on their faces, lead masks. Cold, featureless, metallic shields covering their eyes and noses, like something pulled straight from a horror movie or a science experiment gone terribly wrong. Nearby, investigators discovered several items that made the scene even stranger: empty bottles, one with a faint chemical smell, another suspiciously clean, a small notebook filled with cryptic instructions, written in precise, careful handwriting, and a handful of capsules whose contents would later confound toxicologists. No signs of a struggle. No evidence of an intruder. Nothing that suggested a fight, robbery, or anything you'd typically associate with murder. The police were baffled. Even seasoned officers, the kind who had seen decades of human depravity, were left staring at the scene in disbelief. It didn't look like a crime. It didn't look like an accident. And yet, it was impossible to ignore the sense that something extraordinary had occurred here. Some kind of ritual. Or an experiment gone wrong. The scene radiated a cold, calculated precision, like someone had planned every detail, except for the outcome. The neighborhood was abuzz. Rumors spread quickly, whispered conversations filling the streets. Some claimed the men were involved in spiritual experiments, attempting to contact another plane of existence. Others suspected more sinister possibilities, secret cults, occult rituals, maybe even extraterrestrial involvement. But no one could explain why two ordinary men, living quiet lives in an unassuming neighborhood, would end up dead in such a bizarre way. As night fell over Vinton Hill, the mystery deepened. Police cordoned off the area, curious neighbors peered through fences, and journalists began arriving, hungry for details. But the truth, whatever it was, remained just out of reach, hidden behind those cold, metallic masks. And in that moment, one thing became terrifyingly clear: what had happened here was not just a tragedy. It was a puzzle, and nobody, neither the authorities nor the local residents, had the key. The men were later identified as Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana, both in their 30s, and in the eyes of their neighbors, they were unremarkable. At least at first glance. Quiet men who kept to themselves, with a modest routine that never seemed to raise suspicion. They were polite, orderly, and always a little different from the rest of the neighborhood, but in a way that was hard to define. Neighbors recalled seeing them spend long hours in their small apartment, hunched over notebooks, scribbling diagrams, or reading thick, worn volumes that smelled faintly of chemicals and paper. They spoke little of their work, only hinting at ideas that sounded strange, sometimes impossible, traveling beyond the limits of the human mind, communicating with forces invisible to most, or even glimpsing the unknown. It wasn't just curiosity that defined them, it was obsession. Both men were deeply interested in spiritualism, science, and the obscure boundary where the two intersected. Manuel had a quiet intensity about him, a man who moved with purpose and rarely smiled, but whose eyes seemed to see things others could not. Miguel, by contrast, carried an energy that was harder to describe, an excitement that made him approachable, almost magnet. But with an undercurrent of tension that hinted at hidden knowledge. The two of them were inseparable. They shared ideas, experiments, and a vision, a belief that the human mind could access something beyond ordinary reality. Letters and journals found later described their attempts to reach higher consciousness, to open themselves to forces and realms unseen. They wrote about vibrations, signals, and energies that supposedly existed all around us, things that could be felt if one knew the right method. Some of their experiments were mundane, almost comical by comparison: meditative exercises, attempts at telepathy, and carefully controlled sensory deprivation. But other experiments were far more bizarre. Reports hinted at the use of chemicals intended to alter perception, bottles containing unknown substances, and complex rituals performed with meticulous precision. These weren't casual attempts at spiritual growth, they were serious, deliberate, and dangerous experiments with the mind and the unknown. And yet, despite all their studies and meticulous notes, nothing in their lives suggested they were on a path that would end here, in the open, faces covered with lead masks, lying side by side on the grass like statues frozen in a moment of time. It seemed impossible that such ordinary men could end their lives, or meet their deaths, in a way so extraordinary. Some who knew them speculated that the masks themselves were symbolic, meant to shield the eyes from some unseen force or light, a precaution against whatever they expected to encounter. Others suggested that the capsules found near their bodies were intended to prepare them for an altered state, perhaps even to transcend the physical entirely. The notebooks, with their cryptic instructions, seemed to confirm it. These men were following a plan, a ritual, a procedure they had mapped out with precision. Yet, for all the preparation, something went wrong. Or perhaps, something went beyond human understanding. Manuel and Miguel had vanished into whatever they were trying to reach, leaving only the most surreal scene imaginable for those who discovered them. Police officers, forensic experts, and curious neighbors all struggled to reconcile the image of these carefully prepared men with the eerie finality of death. What exactly were they trying to do? And why did it end here, in a quiet neighborhood on Vinton Hill, with no one to witness their final experiment except the officers and a growing crowd of onlookers? There was no sign of panic. No sign of struggle. Nothing to indicate fear. Only the calm, methodical execution of something so strange, so otherworldly, that it defied ordinary explanation. It was as if Manuel and Miguel had stepped into a world beyond our own, a world they had longed to find, but somehow, the world they sought did not answer back. Or perhaps it did. And that is what made the lead mask's case one of the most unsettling, perplexing, and enduring mysteries in Brazilian history. Two men, brilliant or obsessed, attempting to pierce the veil of reality, only to leave behind a scene that haunted everyone who saw it. Even now, decades later, the story of Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana lingers in the imagination, a chilling reminder of how far curiosity can take a person and how thin the line can be between discovery and disaster. Investigators combing the scene found a small notebook lying on the grass nearby, its pages worn and carefully written in neat, precise handwriting. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary notebook, the kind a student might carry to jot down reminders. But as the police flipped through the pages, it became immediately clear that this was no ordinary journal. Every line, every sentence, carried purpose. There were detailed calculations, strange diagrams, and notes about timing and positioning. The handwriting was almost obsessive in its precision, each letter neatly formed. Each instruction underlined and marked with care. Then came the page that would confound the investigators more than anything else. It read like a set of instructions for a ritual, or perhaps a scientific experiment beyond comprehension. Be at the specified location at 6 p.m. Wear the lead masks. Take the capsules. Wait for the signal. For seasoned police officers, the instructions were immediately perplexing. Capsules. Lead masks. Signal. None of it made sense. There was no context, no explanation, nothing to indicate what these men expected to happen. The words were precise, clinical even, but they led to nowhere. It sounded like the kind of thing you'd read in a science fiction story, or a dark novel about spiritualism, not a real-life tragedy that had ended with two men lying dead in a quiet Brazilian neighborhood. The capsules were taken for testing. Police feared they might contain poison, hallucinogens, or some chemical intended to alter perception. But toxicology came back clean. The capsules were inert. Harmless. And yet, they had been ingested, or at least placed near these men at the time of their deaths. Bottles scattered across the scene were tested as well. They contained chemicals, yes, but nothing lethal, nothing that could have caused sudden death. Nothing that could explain how two seemingly healthy men could die simultaneously without leaving any trace of trauma. And then there were the masks. Lead masks. Cold, metallic, covering the eyes and noses of both men. Why lead? Was it meant to shield them from something physical, like light or radiation? Or was it entirely symbolic, part of some ritual meant to protect them as they reached for a state of higher consciousness? Investigators and journalists alike would struggle for decades to explain this choice. Even today, the image of two grown men lying in neat clothes, shoes polished, faces obscured by metallic masks, has the power to chill anyone who imagines it. The scene itself suggested careful planning. Every detail was deliberate. Their clothes were immaculate, shoes polished to a mirror shine, hands resting calmly by their sides. There was no evidence of struggle, no sign that anyone else had been involved. Nothing indicated foul play. Whatever had happened, Manuel and Miguel had executed it themselves, and executed it with remarkable precision. Witnesses described the men leaving their apartment that day as if it were just another day. Calm, collected, entirely ordinary. No nervous glances, no sudden rushes to finish chores, no frantic farewells. They walked out like men who knew exactly what was about to happen, and who were perfectly at ease with it. As investigators dug deeper, the questions mounted. What exactly was the signal they were waiting for? Some theorized that the men had believed they would see a light, hear a sound, or feel a presence from another realm, a communication from a dimension beyond ordinary human perception. Others wondered whether they had attempted some form of self-induced transcendence, trying to reach a higher state of consciousness that would allow them to interact with forces invisible to the rest of us. And then there were the theories that seemed almost impossible to entertain, yet couldn't be entirely dismissed. Had they been attempting contact with extraterrestrial intelligence? Some researchers pointed to their interest in spiritualism, the occult, and experimental psychology. Their notes contained references to vibrations, energies, and phenomena that the average person would dismiss as fantasy. But Manuel and Miguel treated them with rigorous seriousness. To them, these were not abstract ideas, they were possibilities, paths toward knowledge or experience that could not be achieved by conventional means. The toxicology results added an extra layer of mystery. If the capsules were harmless, if the bottles contained nothing lethal, how had they died? There were no wounds, no trauma, no physical cause of death. It was as if the very act of waiting, of participating in the ritual, had been enough to end their lives. The more conventional explanations were eliminated, the more the case drifted into territory that seemed almost supernatural. Every detail suggested intention. Every element of the scene, from the neat clothing to the carefully positioned bodies, implied that the men had meticulously prepared for what was to come. And yet, despite this preparation, the outcome was catastrophic, or at least, it appeared that way. Two men who had sought knowledge, who had pursued something extraordinary, had vanished into mystery. Their deaths were not violent, nor messy, they were precise, clean, and eerily controlled. The public reaction added another layer of intrigue. Neighbors whispered about cults, occult rituals, and strange practices. Journalists speculated endlessly about what the men had been doing, sometimes leaning toward the sensational, sometimes toward the rational. Books and articles would later describe them as either spiritual seekers or dangerously obsessed men, but no consensus ever emerged. The notebooks, the masks, the capsules, these remained stubbornly enigmatic, refusing to yield any clear explanation. And perhaps the most haunting question of all remained unanswered: what had Manuel and Miguel hoped to achieve that day? Did they expect to see something extraordinary, to hear some cosmic message, or to reach a plane of consciousness beyond the physical world? Or had they simply miscalculated, and fallen victim to an experiment that had gone horribly wrong? It was a puzzle that seemed designed to resist solution. Even seasoned investigators found themselves questioning reality as they pieced together the scene. How could two men, so ordinary in every visible sense, end up dead in a ritual so precise, so calculated, and yet so unfathomably strange? By the end of the investigation, one fact became undeniable: Manuel and Miguel had left behind more questions than answers. They had created a mystery that would endure for decades, a puzzle that would fascinate, terrify, and confuse anyone who encountered it. And in the quiet of Bedtime Hill, on that fateful August day, two men had vanished into a story that would not let go, a story in which the questions were far more terrifying than any possible answer. Because in the lead mask's case, the ordinary world intersects with the unknown, and sometimes, the unknown wins. From this point, theories about what had happened on Bedtime Hill began to multiply, and with each new idea, the case grew stranger, darker, and more unsettling. Some suggested a simple explanation: that Manuel and Miguel had accidentally overdosed on chemicals used in one of their experiments. After all, the men were known to experiment with substances designed to alter perception or consciousness. Perhaps, the thinking went, the capsules had some effect beyond what investigators could measure, or the combination of chemicals and stress had triggered a fatal reaction. But even this theory faltered under scrutiny. Toxicology results showed no trace of poison, no drugs, no chemicals capable of causing death. The capsules were inert. The bottles held nothing lethal. The puzzle resisted every attempt to force it into an understandable frame. Another theory was darker, more human: suicide. Could this have been a pact? Two friends, or perhaps two co-researchers, choosing to end their lives together in a ritualistic way? It seemed possible, at least on the surface. The precise preparation, the calm demeanor as witnesses saw them leave their apartment, the meticulous arrangement of their bodies. All of it suggested forethought. And yet, even this theory left enormous gaps. There was no note explaining why, no declaration of despair, no trace of personal turmoil or conflict. Manuel and Miguel had been obsessed with spiritualism, science, and the unknown, but obsession alone did not explain why they would die together, wearing lead masks, following such cryptic instructions. And then there were the whispers that seemed almost impossible to entertain in rational circles: extraterrestrial contact. Some theorists speculated that the men had believed they were preparing to witness or interact with something beyond Earth. The lead masks might have been a form of protection from an otherworldly light, the capsules a tool to alter perception, and the signal something entirely non-human, a message or presence the men had expected to arrive at precisely 6 p.m. It was sensational, yes, bordering on the impossible, but in a case where conventional logic failed, the extraordinary seemed suddenly plausible. Despite the theories, none of them fit perfectly. The lead masks alone defied explanation. Why lead? It isn't the most practical material to wear for any experiment or ritual. It's heavy, uncomfortable, and serves no obvious purpose unless there was something they expected to shield themselves from. The capsules offered no answers. The bottles were innocuous. The meticulous positioning of the body suggested intention, but intention toward what? The precise symmetry of their final resting positions was almost ceremonial, as if the men had been staging themselves for an event that never occurred. Investigators began to realize something unsettling: the case would not yield to conventional logic. Every avenue they explored, poison, overdose, suicide, accident, led only to further questions. Every witness statement, every piece of evidence, seemed designed to deepen the mystery rather than clarify it. And as news of the deaths spread, journalists, paranormal enthusiasts, and curious members of the public began speculating, theorizing, and even sensationalizing. Some reports claimed that the men had been attempting to reach a higher plane of existence, to see the invisible forces that surrounded the world. Others suggested they had been performing a form of psychic experiment, hoping to trigger a phenomenon beyond current scientific understanding. The notebooks, with their cryptic instructions, became central to every theory. Some read them as ritualistic, a step-by-step guide to spiritual ascension. Others interpreted them as experimental, designed to manipulate perception or energy. And yet, no interpretation satisfied all the evidence. The more people tried to fit the story into a framework they understood, the more it resisted. It became a case that haunted not only the investigators who had to report on it, but also the journalists who tried to explain it, and the paranormal enthusiasts who hoped it might offer a glimpse of something beyond human comprehension. Every detail seemed like a clue, every object a potential key, but the puzzle refused to be solved. And then there were the unanswered questions that gnawed at everyone who studied the case. What exactly was the signal they were waiting for? What would have happened if it had arrived? Were the lead masks meant to protect them, or to complete some ritual? Did Manuel and Miguel die as a result of miscalculation, or did they cross into something no one else could ever understand? And, most chilling of all, were they truly gone? Or had they somehow succeeded in reaching the state they sought, leaving the world behind in a way that made no sense to those still bound by ordinary life? The lead masks case became, over time, more than a local curiosity. It became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that some human desires, to see beyond, to touch the unseen, to reach for the extraordinary, come with risks we may never understand. It was a story that left a mark, a haunting tale of two men whose pursuit of knowledge, or experience, or contact with something beyond the ordinary ended in a scene that continues to puzzle and terrify. Even decades later, the case refuses closure. Every time someone studies the details, the precise clothing, the polished shoes, the capsules, the lead masks, the cryptic instructions, one cannot help but feel that Manuel and Miguel were attempting something that was never meant to be fully understood. That they were walking along a path that few humans would ever tread, and in doing so, created a mystery that still captures the imagination, chills the spine, and reminds us that sometimes the questions themselves are far scarier than any answer could ever be. Because in the lead masks case, reality itself seems to bend. Logic fails. And two ordinary men become the center of one of the strangest, most confounding mysteries in modern history. Decades have passed since that August day in 1966, but the lead mask's case continues to haunt anyone who studies it. Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana remain enigmas, not just because of the circumstances of their deaths, but because their story defies explanation. The police closed the case as death under mysterious circumstances, with ritualistic overtones, yet closure never truly came. Forensic experts, historians, and journalists still debate what happened. All that remains are the worn notebooks, the inert capsules, and the cold, metallic masks, so stark against the calm green grass of Bintam Hill.
That was another real bedtime story from Wicked Nightmares Horror Stories. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.